my occasional Gestalt Authentic Living vlog. So, I'm in London at the moment. I've been here actually for almost 4 months. Originally, we were going to be here for a month visiting my son, and then I was going to head back to China, but that's not happening. So I may get to China soon, or I may just go back to Australia. It's a funny old world. Yeah. So I thought I'd say something about, current contemporary issue. That's one of them that's up, specifically about racism and Black Lives Matter, and what's been happening in the US and now around the world regards to that. Because I wanted to make some kind of contribution to see what I could say that is of value from a Gestalt point of view, my Gestalt point of view. And generally Gestalt's about individuals and your feelings and what you want and what's happening in your life and who you are, all very important existential kind of questions. And that's the context in which Gestalt tends to be applied, is with individuals or maybe couples, sometimes groups, but generally it's about intrapsychic or interpersonal dynamics. So when it comes to these kind of social issues, where is Gestalt in all that, and what does Gestalt have to contribute? So what I'd have to say is a few things, I think. One of them is that Gestalt, one of the pillars of Gestalt, field theory, which is a core part of Gestalt and drew originally on the work of people like Jan Smuts, 1926, I think. Holism and Evolution was the book that he wrote. He was the president at the time of South Africa. Very interesting man. And Gestalt psychology itself, which takes a sort of holistic view of life and perception, and on which Gestalt therapy is founded. These elements of holism are inherent to Gestalt, and psychotherapy and the Gestalt process is one application, but it's equally relevant to talk about, it can be applied in organizations, can be applied in families, it can be applied on these larger levels. It can also be applied in terms of social systems. So how? Well, field theory describes a way of looking at life and looking at experience which is less focused on the individual and more focused on the interconnections, especially the complex interconnections, the threads that bind us all together, and at the question of context, the larger field. So there's context at every level of experience. I have my body experience, and there's a context to that. There's my history and my family and my genetics and my upbringing and the choices in my life and the people that are around me, all of which affect my health and the place that I live. And you can take any element of an individual's experience and we can look at the context. So we can look at the economic context, the political, social, cultural, etc. And all that helps us understand someone's experience. Field theory also gives us a broader way of grasping complexity without having to analyze and break it down to its separate parts. It also helps us, gives us a more sophisticated understanding of causality, that just one thing doesn't just cause another in some simple linear form, but in fact that we talk about circular causality, where something causes something that goes in a circle, and you see that in families, you see that in organizations, and we see that in society. So field theory has a lot to offer in terms of understanding human phenomena, including wider social issues. So in this case, we're talking about a specific incident that got all this going of very violent treatment of a black person by a white person in authority, a cop. And that's unleashed a lot of anger and a lot of motivation for making things different, which I think is great. So if we use Gestalt and we say, well, how does Gestalt contribute here? In what ways can Gestalt be of value to this large social issue? Well, there's a whole lot of things. Firstly, certainly, is understanding people's individual psychology, including fixed beliefs, what Spinelli calls sedimentation, very fixed ideas. In Gestalt, we call them introjects. So in Gestalt, we're always wanting to uncover people's introjects, the beliefs that are fueling them, often inherited from family or society, and to help people chew those over and deconstruct them, find out what's true for them. So a lot of destructive social beliefs, such as racism, are in fact introjects. They're things people have swallowed, and although someone will mouth those ideas as if they're their own, you know, I would say if I was going to have a conversation with that person, probably they've swallowed them from somewhere. And so the individual interpersonal process that I think makes a difference on every level is to be able to help people examine the things that they swallowed and to really see what fits and what doesn't. Now, of course, there's lots of people that aren't interested in doing that, and people that maybe are explicit racists may not be. But it's interesting when you look at some interesting explorations and brave experiments that people have done by, you know, like black people going to talk to Ku Klux Klansmen or something. And they've actually essentially done that. They've broken down their fixed ideas and got them to look at, you know, actual people and actual experiences. And that tends to sort of soften or dissolve rigid ideas. So that's the Gestalt concept of introjection, which, you know, really needs to happen on a wider social level, that we have ways collectively to break down these introjects and to help people develop critical thinking and examine those beliefs. So I think Gestalt has some interesting things to contribute on that level. Also, on a field level, as a way of thinking about and understanding social phenomena, I think that sort of holistic systemic thinking, which Gestalt is based on, is important for looking at social issues. Because if you just break down things into very simple sound bites, which, you know, is useful for marketing or communicating ideas, sending them around the world, that can be valuable. However, in terms of really grappling with social issues, you know, obviously we need a much more complex way of thinking in terms of affecting real and long-lasting change. So that way of thinking, field theory, offers principles which can help us engage in that kind of thinking, which is, I think, very much what's needed. I guess field theory also helps us understand, as I say, context. And a lot of the difficulty with racism is that, sure, there's people on the far right, whatever, just ridiculously racist and explicitly racist. But, you know, there's a lot of people on a kind of a spectrum. And ordinary people, me, I'm white, anti-racist, would never want to be racist. And yet, you know, there's all sorts of assumptions that I have, or lack of awareness I might have, that can mean that I could do things or not do things which are necessary to either fight racism or deal with the actuality of it in, you know, meeting real people. So awareness, that's a big thing in Gestalt. So this is one area that in Gestalt we could, you know, as a contribution here, help consciousness raising, developing people's awareness. And we know in Gestalt that it's very difficult for people to step outside their awareness into becoming more aware. On every level, people tend to avoid that, resist it, and especially when it's something, difficult social topics such as racism. So certainly the Gestalt approach to awareness and understanding how it is that we can slowly expand people's awareness, of course they have to kind of want to do that, you know, that can be part of understanding the psychology of helping people understand how to be less racist or how to confront racism in the workplace. And then I was saying about context, and so say ordinary people, just to have a shorthand, who, you know, don't want to be racist, are sometimes confronted by microaggressions, all sorts of terms which suggest that even though you don't want to be racist, you know, you still might be. That's difficult to swallow, not part of my identity. So understanding things contextually can be really helpful My son, Janesh, works for the London Ambulance Service. He was telling me that a couple of the guys he was working with the other day were, they weren't racist, but they were like, well, I'm not racist, so how's this about me? Like, they don't understand that it's not just about the individual, or I don't do things to black people, but it's, we're part of an embedded system with all sorts of privilege and assumptions, and so understanding that context is a part of making a difference. And I think that in terms of educating people, informing people, or bringing about transformation, that being able to communicate an understanding of context is an essential part of it. Otherwise, people tend to think of these very linear terms, or just like, well, I don't treat black people badly, so, it's not about me. So, yeah, these are some of the ways that I think Gestalt can help us think about, create actions that counter racism and other, destructive social sentiments. I think there's more too. I think there's a lot in field theory, actually, which can be applied in these situations. And also, I guess the other thing I'd say is about dialogue. Gestalt's very much about dialogue and interpersonal dialogue, for instance, sometimes intrapersonal, we do the two-chair. So also dialogue can happen, intra-group dialogue. And when Gestalt's applied in organizational settings, then sometimes you do that dialogue between teams, for instance. In this case, we're talking about dialogue between different sort of social groups or different racial groups. And that's, I think, a big contribution Gestalt can make to how we can facilitate that kind of dialogue, how we can meet in an I-thou space rather than just in a conflictual one. Because although conflict is necessary and it's good to, oppose police brutality and have political action, ultimately it's dialogue that really, I think, brings about transformation. And if we just go back historically, if I can make a simplistic observation, yes, in the Civil War in the US, it was won by the Northern forces, the anti-slavery forces, so to speak. But you see what happened is that even though they won, the same attitudes continued under Jim Crow and such, so that, black people and African Americans in the South especially, were treated very, very, very badly. So in a way, the attitudes didn't really change. So we could say, although there was political change in many ways and some legal changes, people's hearts didn't change. And I think it's that dialogue was necessary at those times. Now we've got much more sophisticated means of communication and such that it can be possible to establish these kinds of dialogue across differences. And unfortunately, at the moment, what happens is tends to be a lot of polarization. And for political social change, sometimes polarization is useful to mobilize people, have a clear enemy, racism, whatever it is, police brutality. But ultimately, I think social change in a much deeper way and a much more long-lasting way comes about through dialogue. So polarization, which is a lot of how these discussions get conducted in the media or in social media, I don't think are very helpful. So I think Gestalt also has something to contribute about how this dialogue can occur. So these are a few of my thoughts on the subject. I hope it's useful, makes a contribution, maybe makes you think about these things. And in my course structure, my Gestalt training, I have a unit in fourth year on, I call it Gestalt and the Larger Ecology, because I think that Gestalt is very relevant to applying to wider social issues. And I'm excited about where and how that contribution can occur. So thanks for listening. Talk to you another time.